You know that feeling when you want to get your head around something really important in the business world, but just the sheer volume of information feels, well, overwhelming.
Yeah, totally. We get it.
That's why you're here and why we're here. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Where we sift through the noise, basically.
Exactly. We extract the crucial insights from, a stack of sources and deliver them straight to you.
So you can get up to speed without feeling like you're drowning in info.
Today, we're taking a fascinating plunge into a really significant shift happening in Japanese business.
Yes, the evolving face of corporate management. It's quite something.
For a long time, Japan's business world had a pretty distinct character, right? You might think of consensus building and a strong emphasis on all stakeholders.
Mm-hmm. But the information we've been looking at shows that the landscape is definitely changing.
And in some pretty fundamental ways.
Absolutely.
The articles and research we've been digging through paint a clear picture of this evolution, really from a variety of angles.
Yeah, we're looking at everything from new government regulations and a noticeable increase in shareholder activism.
To the real impact of demographic shifts and, of course, the constant pressures of globalization.
So our mission today is, well, pretty straightforward.
We want to give you a clear and engaging understanding of the most significant changes in Japanese corporate management.
And, crucially, why they matter. We'll be highlighting some surprising facts and, connecting the dots for you.
In a way that's easy to grasp and hopefully maybe even a little bit interesting.
Okay, let's unpack this. What are the major forces really pushing this transformation forward?
Well, these shifts aren't happening in isolation. They're being driven by a really potent mix of factors.
Right.
We can broadly group them into, let's say, regulatory and governmental actions,
Right.
the growing influence of shareholders, which is huge, significant demographic and labor market pressures,
Yes,
and the essential need to adapt to globalization and competition.
that's a good breakdown.
So let's start with the regulatory and governmental push. It sounds like there's a really coordinated effort underway there.
That's absolutely right. Governmental bodies like MEDI, that's the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry,
Right.
the Financial Services Agency, the FSA,
Yeah.
and the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the TSE. They're all actively working to drive reform.
And it feels kind of aligned, this framework.
It is. Think of it as a strategy coming from multiple directions, pushing in the same general way.
Okay, so tell me more. What exactly are they doing? What are the specifics?
Well, the updates to Japan's Corporate Governance Code and Stewardship Code have been central, really key.
Okay.
These are encouraging things like having more independent directors on company boards,
Mm-hmm.
promoting greater diversity, including reporting on sustainability efforts,
Right.
and really focusing on creating long-term value for the company.
Okay.
And there's this comply or explain principle.
Ah, right.
So companies need to either follow these guidelines or, explain why they're not.
So it puts the onus on them?
Exactly. And this move towards independent directors, it signals a fundamental shift away from sort of the traditional old boys network
Interesting.
and aims to bring more objective oversight to corporate decision-making, challenging those long-held norms of internal control.
Interesting. So it's not a strict rule, but companies have to justify their choices. That brings a new level of accountability, doesn't it?
It really does.
What else is happening on the regulatory front?
Well, METI has been quite active, especially with its 2023 guidelines for corporate takeovers.
Okay, takeovers.
Yeah. And what's fascinating here is a clear shift towards being more open to mergers and acquisitions, M&A.
Really? That feels like a big change for Japan.
It is. They're redefining what makes a company valuable with a much stronger emphasis on shareholder interests,
Right.
which is a significant change from a previously, let's say, cautious stance towards unsolicited bids.
Wow. So hostile bids aren't quite as taboo.
It seems that way.
Mhm.
It's a significant departure from that historical preference for just maintaining stable business relationships and avoiding hostile takeovers.
Okay.
And METI is even currently studying potential amendments to the Companies Act to help boost corporate earning power.
Wow, that does sound like a pretty big deal, a real indication that things are changing at a foundational level.
Absolutely.
And the Tokyo Stock Exchange is also playing a role here, right? The TSE.
Definitely. The TSE is using its listing requirements, especially for companies on their prime and standard markets, to really push them to focus on their cost of capital and what their stock price looks like.
Ah, the bottom line.
Pretty much. There's a particular focus on companies with a price-to-book ratio, or PBR below 1.
Okay, explain PBR below 1 again quickly.
Right, so a PBR below 1 basically signals that the market values the company's assets at less than their book value.
Which is not great.
It's a potential red flag for inefficiency.
Yeah.
So the TSE is asking those companies to explain how they plan to improve.
Got it. Direct pressure. It's very direct. And the TSE is also encouraging more companies to provide information in English.
To attract international investors.
Exactly. And they're even setting goals for gender diversity on boards.
So if your stock price isn't performing well, the exchange itself is putting pressure on you to improve. That's a pretty direct way to encourage change.
It is. It's quite effective.
And what about the Financial Services Agency, the FSA? What's their part in all of this?
The FSA is concentrating on making sure there's more transparency, better disclosure.
Okay.
For example, they're pushing for more details on things like cross-shareholdings.
Where companies own shares in each other. Still a thing.
Still a thing, but under scrutiny. And they want more disclosure on sustainability efforts, too.
Makes sense.
They're also actively encouraging more communication, more dialogue between Japanese companies and investors from around the world.
Global investors.
Precisely. And the fact that the FSA often works together with MIDI and the TSE,
Yeah.
it really highlights how coordinated this reform effort is. It's not just isolated actions. It's a unified approach.
Exactly. Across different parts of the government.
Yeah.
Making reform less of an option and, frankly, more of a necessity.
Okay, so that's what's happening from the government and regulatory side, a big push. Now, you mentioned the increasing power of the shareholder voice. How is that reshaping things?
This is a really dynamic area. Really dynamic. We're seeing a significant increase in how much influence shareholders have, and a notable rise in what's called shareholder activism.
Activism is definitely on the rise globally. Seems like Japan, too.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Mergers and acquisitions have become more common, partly supported by MEDI's more open stance towards M&A we just talked about.
Right.
They now even acknowledge that unsolicited bids can actually be helpful sometimes.
Helpful. How so?
Well, in shaking up companies that aren't performing well, pushing for change, it's quite a cultural shift.
So the idea of one company trying to take over another, even if the target company doesn't want it, it might not be as frowned upon as it used to be.
That's the direction it's heading. It's a big change, yeah.
And this shareholder activism is Japan becoming a major center for it. You mentioned it's rising.
It absolutely is. Japan is now one of the top places globally for shareholder activism.
Yeah.
It's quite remarkable.
Wow. Any numbers on that?
Yeah, the number of companies facing demands from activists increased nearly 5-fold between 2016 and 2022.
5-fold.
Oh.
Okay. What are they pushing for?
Mostly things like better use of the company's money, better capital allocation, higher returns to shareholders, like through dividends and buying back shares,
Bags, yeah.
and even changes to who sits on the board of directors and in the management team.
So fundamental changes.
Yes, and the TSE's focus on PBR, that price-to-book ratio,
Yeah.
is really creating a favorable environment for these activists
Yeah.
to target companies they see as not using their capital effectively.
So the TSE is almost pointing activists towards targets.
In a way, yes. It highlights the underperformers.
Yeah.
And the increasing success of shareholder activism in Japan, it indicates a maturing understanding of corporate governance.
Oh, that's so.
Well, investors are no longer just passive stakeholders. They're becoming active agents in driving value creation.
Which is a significant departure from the past, right?
Huge departure.
So it's not just about complaining anymore. There's real power behind these demands.
Precisely. There's been a fundamental shift in how corporate value itself is being understood.
Okay.
There's a growing emphasis on, well, measurable shareholder value, quantitative value,
Right. Numbers.
which makes it harder for companies to simply dismiss bids or demands based solely on the interests of other stakeholders, like maybe employees or the community in the traditional sense.
Interesting tension there.
Definitely. And the role of institutional investors is also changing. The Stewardship Code encourages them to actively engage with the companies they invest in.
So the big funds have to be more active.
They're supposed to be. Foreign investors are playing a bigger role in how companies are run. And even investors within Japan, domestic investors, are showing more willingness to support reasonable proposals from activists.
So local institutions are getting on board too.
Increasingly, yes.
It sounds like shareholder activism is becoming a really important external way to ensure companies are, well, being run well, keeping them honest.
That's a key point. It's acting as an external enforcement mechanism for these new governance standards.
Yeah.
The Corporate Governance Code, the Stewardship Code.
Got it.
It's helping to address that traditional issue of management being too insulated, maybe from outside pressure.
Right, the insider-controlled management idea.
Exactly. And we're even seeing examples where activist campaigns have directly led to companies buying back more of their own shares and management teams just becoming more responsive, more willing to engage.
So the takeaway is Japanese companies can no longer just assume their shareholders will passively go along with whatever management decides.
Not anymore. They need to actively communicate with their investors.
And clearly explain their plans for creating long-term value.
Precisely. It's a new ballgame.
Okay, that's a lot of change coming from the top, the regulators, and from the owners, the shareholders. But you also mentioned pressures from demographics and the labor market. How are those factors contributing?
These are really fundamental long-term forces at play. Deep structural changes.
Okay.
Japan's aging population and shrinking workforce are creating challenges that, frankly, haven't really been seen before on this scale.
Right.
One of the most critical is a significant shortage of people qualified for executive and leadership roles.
Really? A talent shortage at the COP?
Yes, particularly in areas like HR, actually.
Why HR specifically?
Well, it's partly a combination of maybe inadequate focus on succession planning historically, and simply the fact that there are fewer people of working age overall. The demographic cliff.
Yeah.
It's what some are calling a limited labor supply society. And these demographic trends, they're expected to continue for quite some time. The projections aren't reversing soon.
So there just aren't enough skilled people to fill important positions. That sounds like a major problem for companies trying to grow or even just operate.
It is a major problem.
Yeah.
And it's really putting pressure on traditional ways of working.
Like lifetime employment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The long-standing system of lifetime employment, Shushin Koyo, and promotions and pay based mainly on seniority, how long someone has been with the company, are becoming increasingly unsustainable.
Because the talent pool is shrinking.
Right. Companies now have to compete for talented individuals. And that often means offering more flexible work arrangements.
Right, like remote work or different hours.
And recognizing what people can actually do, their skills and merit, rather than just how long they've been there.
So the old guarantees of a job for life are fading.
They are fading, yes. And companies need to be more competitive now to attract and keep the talent they need.
Exactly. These demographic shifts are really acting as a trigger, aren't they, for modernizing how companies manage their workforce.
A powerful trigger.
It's forcing a move towards valuing merit, performance, and being more strategic about talent management. The traditional approach just isn't going to work with a shrinking pool of workers.
It mathematically can't work long term.
So it's compelling companies to adopt more competitive strategies for pay, for retention, based on skills and how well people actually perform.
Right. You can't just count on someone staying with the company for decades out of loyalty anymore or inertia.
You need to make it worthwhile for them based on what they contribute, their market value.
Exactly. It's becoming much more transactional in some ways.
Okay. And finally, you mentioned the impact of globalization and the need to be competitive. How are those pushing for change?
Well, in a world that's increasingly interconnected, Japanese companies simply need to align with global standards.
If they want to play on the world stage.
Precisely. If they want to attract investors from other countries and be competitive internationally.
And what does that entail? What kind of standards?
It includes things like how they report information transparency again,
Right.
how their companies are governed, the governance codes, and showing that they are focused on creating value for their shareholders, which we've discussed.
So it's about playing by international rules to attract international money and talent and remain competitive globally.
That's a good way to put it. It makes sense, right?
Yeah, it does.
And there's also the global competition for talented employees themselves.
Right. The labor market isn't just domestic anymore.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Japanese companies are now competing with multinationals from all over the world for skilled professionals.
Especially those with international experience.
Especially those, yes. So this means they need to offer attractive salaries, clear paths for career advancement, and appealing work environments. They need to be employers of choice on a global scale.
It's a global marketplace for talent just as much as it is for products, it seems.
Absolutely. And then there's digital transformation, often referred to as DX.
DX, yeah. Buzzword, but important.
Hugely important. This isn't just about becoming more efficient anymore, like automating a few tasks.
Right.
It's absolutely critical for staying competitive. Companies are investing heavily in digital technologies.
Like what?
Well, things to increase their productivity, develop new strategic capabilities, improve how they interact with customers,
With experience.
and just compete effectively on a global level.
So if you're not embracing digital technology, you're likely to fall behind in the global race. Is that fair?
I think that's very fair.
Yeah.
That's the reality now. Globalization is really forcing management practices to become more similar, to converge across different countries.
So less uniquely Japanese management style.
Well, Japanese companies are selectively adopting practices that are more common in, let's say, Western business models,
Okay.
like tying pay more closely to performance, focusing more on shareholder returns,
Yeah.
while also trying to keep their own cultural strengths. Things like omotenashi, the exceptional customer service, and kaizen that focus on continuous improvement.
So trying to blend the best of both worlds.
Exactly. What we're seeing is a new kind of hybrid approach to management emerging.
A combination of traditional Japanese business values and newer, more globally focused practices to try and achieve the best outcomes. Okay, fascinating, Driver. So we've looked at the forces pushing for change. Now, what are the key areas where we're actually seeing these changes take place? What are the core pillars of this management transformation?
Yeah, we can probably identify 4 main pillars or areas of focus.
Okay.
First, a reinvention of governance, really moving beyond just ticking boxes to actively driving value creation.
Right, compliance to value.
Second, an evolving approach to the workforce, navigating those challenges of talent management alongside tradition.
The people side.
Third, a strong push to embrace digital technologies, DX, as a catalyst for innovation.
Tech as an enabler.
And fourth, the increasing importance of environmental, social, and governance factors, ESG, with sustainability becoming a key strategic consideration.
Okay, governance, workforce, DX, ESG. Let's start with governance. You said it's not just about checking boxes anymore.
Exactly. The overhaul of corporate governance in Japan is going beyond simply meeting legal requirements. It's much deeper.
Okay.
It's becoming a system designed to actively boost the value of the company and ensure accountability, real accountability.
And how is that manifesting?
Well, we're seeing significant progress in making boards of directors more effective. A greater focus on using capital efficiently and providing returns to shareholders.
Capital efficiency, right.
And making companies more transparent through better disclosure of information.
And the independent directors we talked about earlier, they're playing a more significant role now, you said.
Yes, there's been a noticeable increase in both the number and, arguably, the influence of independent directors.
Any stats on that?
Yeah, over 90% of the companies listed on the TSE Prime Market now have at least 1/3 of their board members who are independent.
1/3. That's a decent chunk.
It is. And the committees that decide who gets nominated to the board and how executives are compensated.
Nomination and compensation committees, yeah.
They're often made up mostly of independent members now. The goal is to ensure more objective decision-making.
Makes sense.
There are ongoing efforts to further improve the quality, not just the quantity, of these independent directors.
Right.
But, some still wonder if this is truly changing how boards operate fundamentally, or if it's becoming more of a formality in some cases, a box-ticking exercise.
Right, the form over substance concerns.
Yeah.
So it's not just about having independent directors, it's about them actually having a real voice and influencing the company's strategy.
That's the key question. That's the ongoing debate.
What about using capital more efficiently? That's been a big topic, the PBR focus.
Absolutely. There's that strong push from the TSE for companies, especially those with a low PBR.
One's below one.
Exactly. To be much more conscious of their cost of capital, their stock price, and to explain how they plan to improve.
And has that led to changes?
Oh, yes. It has really led to a change in how companies allocate their capital. We've seen a big increase in share buybacks and higher dividend payouts. For example, the total amount spent on buying back shares exceeded a staggering JPY, 10 trillion in the fiscal year ending March 2024.
10 trillion yen. Wow.
It's a huge number. And we're also seeing a concerted effort to reduce those traditional cross-shareholdings.
Selling off stakes in partners or suppliers.
Exactly. The FSA is keeping a close eye on this, and major insurance companies have announced plans to sell off all of these holdings eventually.
So less cash hoarding on the balance sheet.
Right.
And more active management of capital to benefit shareholders. That sounds like a significant shift in mindset for traditionally conservative companies.
It is a major shift. It forces a different kind of discipline.
And transparency is also crucial here, I would imagine, for this all to work.
Absolutely crucial. especially if Japanese companies want to attract those global investors we talked about.
Right.
It will actually be mandatory for companies on the prime market to provide their financial statements and other important timely information in English starting in April 2025.
Mandatory English disclosure.
Now, while many already provide some information in English, there are still concerns about how complete it is, the quality, the timeliness. And there's also a push for more disclosure generally on sustainability efforts, how companies manage their employees, human capital, and their dialogue with shareholders. The FSA is even publishing examples of good disclosure practices to sort of guide companies.
Nudging them along.
Exactly. And this intense focus on PBR and using capital efficiently, it's fundamentally changing how Japanese management thinks about their financial resources.
Moving away from just conservatism.
Moving away from a more conservative, maybe capital preservation approach towards more dynamic strategies aimed at increasing returns for shareholders.
And the push for better English disclosure isn't just a minor detail then.
No, not at all. It's about inviting greater scrutiny from international investors.
Which in turn reinforces the pressure for improvements.
Exactly. It creates a feedback loop.
Okay, governance is getting a significant overhaul. Now let's talk about the workforce. Pillar number 2. You mentioned navigating talent and tradition. What's changing there?
This is a really critical area, as we touched on, driven by those demographic shifts,
Right.
changing expectations from workers themselves, and the need for new skills in the modern economy.
And lifetime employment is fading, you said.
The once highly valued promise of lifetime employment, Shushin Koyu, it's becoming less common.
Is it gone completely?
Not entirely.
Yeah.
It might still exist in some larger, more traditional companies, especially maybe for older employees who've been there a long time.
Okay.
But the overall trend is definitely a decline. Younger generations in particular are increasingly looking for more flexibility,
Yeah.
opportunities to move between companies, gain different experiences, and a better balance between their work and personal lives. Work-life balance is huge.
Which is leading to
Growth of non-traditional forms of employment. Things like fractional hiring, project-based work, the gig economy, infiltrating the professional sphere.
So the old model, join a company straight out of school, stay there forever, get promoted based on age, that's really becoming less and less the norm.
Much less the norm, yes.
Precisely. And we're seeing a shift in how companies view their HR functions too, aren't we?
We are. Moving from a more administrative back-office role
Right. Payroll and paperwork.
to becoming a truly strategic part of the business, focused on managing human capital. Employees are increasingly seen as vital assets, not just costs.
And this is partly a response to that executive talent shortage you mentioned.
It has to be. That shortage has been made worse by perhaps not enough long-term planning for leadership succession in the past.
Right.
So now there's a growing emphasis on continuously developing employees' skills, upskilling, reskilling,
Lifelong learning.
and valuing specific expertise, specific skills, rather than just general long service.
And diversity. What about women in leadership?
Efforts to increase the number of women in leadership positions are definitely gaining momentum. The government has set targets,
Like what?
aiming for 30% women in executive posts by 2030.
Ambitious. How's the progress?
Honestly, progress has been slow. Women hold maybe around 13% of board positions currently,
Okay.
and an even smaller percentage in those internal executive director roles. The real operational power.
So that glass ceiling seems pretty tough to break still.
It does seem quite resilient, unfortunately.
What about how people are being compensated? And what's keeping them with their companies if it's not lifetime employment?
Well, traditional pay structures, mostly fixed salaries with relatively modest annual bonuses,
Yeah.
are being challenged by models that are more common in Western countries,
Yeah.
where incentives are more closely tied to performance.
Pay for performance.
Exactly. To attract and retain the leadership talent they need, especially in this competitive market. And Japanese companies are increasingly adopting performance-based bonuses and long-term incentive plans, like stock options or restricted stock units.
Aligning executives with shareholders.
That's the idea. And the market for experienced executives, particularly those with international experience or specialized skills, is becoming very competitive.
So companies are fighting for top talent.
They are. And some companies are even actively trying to recruit Japanese professionals who have been working overseas back to Japan, repatriating talent.
Interesting. So the decline of lifetime employment combined with the talent shortage is really forcing a reevaluation of the whole employer-employee relationship.
Absolutely. Moving towards something more dynamic, maybe more of a partnership based on skills, contributions, and mutual benefit.
A two-way street.
A two-way street, exactly, based on skills and performance.
Right. Okay, let's move on to Pillar 3, embracing the digital frontier, DX. How is technology acting as a catalyst for change?
Digital transformation, DX, it's rapidly changing how Japanese corporations operate. It's not optional anymore.
It's seen as essential.
Essential for boosting productivity, fostering new ideas, innovation, and fundamentally reshaping how businesses are run, really across all sectors.
What kind of technologies are we talking about?
Well, we're seeing widespread adoption of key enabling technologies. The rollout of 5G networks is happening quickly.
Okay.
Technologies like the Internet of Things, IoT, big data analytics, artificial intelligence, AI, cloud computing, they're becoming increasingly common.
Standard toolkit now.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Even leaders in HR, going back to that function, are now expected to have a good understanding of digital technologies and how they impact the workforce.
Digital fluency for HR. Interesting.
And some companies, like Tokyo Century, are explicitly making DX a central part of their overall business strategy. It's core.
So it's not just about having the latest gadgets, it's about fundamentally changing how businesses operate, integrating tech strategically.
That's the key, strategic integration.
What about specific industries? Where are we seeing this digital transformation really take hold?
Well, the manufacturing sector, which is obviously a cornerstone of the Japanese economy, is investing heavily. They're using data analysis, AI, machine learning for things like predictive maintenance.
Knowing when a machine will break down.
Exactly. And optimizing supply chains, quality control. Think of it as creating smart factories, embracing Industry 4.0 concepts.
Got it. What about retail?
The retail sector is using AI quite a bit to better understand customer behavior, personalize online shopping experiences, optimize pricing and inventory.
Personalization, yeah.
And we're also seeing a lot of partnerships forming, collaborations to speed up DX.
Like who?
Well, for example, SoftBank and NEC are working together on biometrics technology. Global Logic, which is part of the Hitachi Group, has even set up specific operations in Japan just to help other companies accelerate their DX journeys.
So specialists moving in.
Yes. DX is really seen as crucial now for strengthening how companies are managed, encouraging innovation in culture and business models, and ultimately increasing efficiency, reducing costs, and improving customer experiences. It's becoming the backbone for future competitiveness.
Okay. Makes sense. Finally, Pillar 4, the growing importance of ESG. How is sustainability becoming a key strategic driver?
ESG, environmental, social, and governance. These factors are rapidly becoming central to how companies in Japan think about their strategies. It's moved from the periphery to the core.
Why the shift?
It's being driven by several things. National goals around sustainability, increasing demand from investors, both domestic and global, and just a broader recognition, I think, that being sustainable is crucial for creating long-term value and maintaining social license to operate.
And Japan has national commitments, right?
Yes, Japan has a strong national commitment to achieving net zero carbon emissions by 2050.
2050 target.
And the government is aiming for massive investments in green technologies, transition finance. The Corporate Governance Code also explicitly encourages companies to report on their sustainability efforts. So it's embedded in the regulatory framework now.
So it's not just about being environmentally friendly because it's nice. It's becoming integrated into the core business strategy and reporting.
Exactly. It's about risk management, opportunity identification, and long-term value.
And are investors paying close attention to this? Is ESG investing big in Japan?
Absolutely. Japan is seeing a significant increase in ESG investing. It's actually quite interesting because some other parts of the world have seen this slow down a bit recently, maybe some backlash. But in Japan, the growth continues. The market for sustainability-linked bonds, for instance, doubled in 2023.
Doubled. Wow.
Yeah. And there's a growing trend of including ESG performance metrics and how executives are compensated, linking pay to sustainability goals.
Staying in the game.
Exactly. Companies are focusing on things like reducing their carbon emissions, decarbonization, adopting a circular economy approach where resources are reused and waste is minimized, promoting diversity and inclusion, which is the S part.
Social, yeah.
And ensuring their supply chains are sustainable and transparent, looking beyond their own operations.
Can you give me some specific examples of companies putting these ESG principles into action? Who's doing interesting stuff?
Certainly. Toyota, for instance, has its Environmental Challenge 2050 and is actively tracking emissions throughout its entire value chain, Scope 3 emissions.
Okay.
Mitsubishi Electric is focusing heavily on the circular economy. Panasonic is working to reduce the use of critical rare materials in its batteries.
Important for EVs.
Very important. We're also seeing financial institutions like Mizuho and Dai-ichi Life being recognized with awards for their leadership in ESG finance, funding the transition.
So the banks are playing a key role.
A crucial role. And even companies like Caron Holdings in the food and beverage industry have developed comprehensive sustainability transition plans covering climate, natural resources, everything.
It seems quite widespread then.
It is. And interestingly, Japan's approach to regulating ESG has often been described as somewhat moderate.
Moderate. How so?
Perhaps less prescriptive, more principles-based than in some other regions. And some believe this has helped Japan avoid some of the intense anti-ESG sentiment or political polarization seen elsewhere.
Interesting point. But does it always pay off financially?
Well, that's the complexity. We're even observing what's some call the ESG paradox in Japan.
The ESG paradox.
Yeah, where strong ESG efforts don't always immediately correlate with better short-term financial performance. It suggests that the market is maybe still figuring out how to fully value these long-term sustainability initiatives in the share price right now.
So it sounds like ESG is definitely not just something nice to have anymore. It's becoming a fundamental part of doing business responsibly and strategically in Japan, even if the short-term market link isn't always clear.
That sums it up well. It's strategic, it's long-term.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier that this transformation isn't happening at the same pace across all industries.
Right. Where are we seeing companies really taking the lead and perhaps some that are lagging behind in this new era? Sectoral differences.
That's right. While these big trends, governance, DX, ESG, workforce changes are widespread, how they're being adopted and the impact they're having definitely vary from sector to sector.
Okay. Let's take manufacturing first. Big sector for Japan.
Right. In manufacturing, we're seeing a growing use of those digital technologies. We talked about AI, analytics to improve efficiency, quality control.
Sort factories.
Exactly. And sustainability efforts are often focused on things like greening their supply chains, reducing Scope 3 emissions.
Right, looking beyond their own walls.
And embracing circular economy principles. We're also seeing changes in how these companies are structured, like Hitachi selling off quite a few of its listed subsidiaries.
Why?
To sharpen its focus on core areas like green technologies and digital solutions, strategic streamlining.
So manufacturers are really having to rethink their traditional processes and even their corporate structures.
They are. It's a significant adaptation.
What about the financial sector? Banks, insurers, they seem to have a big role to play, both internally and externally.
They certainly do. We're seeing significant changes in how they're governed, particularly among the big casualty insurers.
Like unwinding cross-shareholdings.
Yes. Major players like MS&A, Sompo, Tokyo Marine are unwinding those cross-shareholdings, partly due to FSA scrutiny after that pricing cartel issue.
Right.
And partly due to shareholder pressure. And the money from selling those shares often goes towards share buybacks.
Returning capital.
Exactly. It's a departure from their traditional role as passive, stable, long-term shareholders in other companies.
And ESG. Finance must be central to that.
Absolutely central. Financial institutions are really at the forefront of integrating ESG, both in their own operations and in their financing activities.
Like who?
Institutions like Mizuho, Dai-ichi Life, Nippon Life are actively promoting sustainable finance, getting recognized for it, embedding ESG into their investment decisions. And interestingly, financial institutions themselves can also be targets for activist investors. That pressure to unwind cross-holdings is partly an activist response too.
So they're feeling the heat as well.
Yes. And if you look at ESG-focused stock market indices in Japan, like the FTSE Blossom Japan Index, the financial sector often shows strong performance, suggesting that the market is rewarding the ESG leaders within that sector.
Interesting. It sounds like finance is both driving and being driven by these changes, a key nexus point.
That's a good way to describe it.
What about the tech and telecom sectors? They must be at the forefront of the digital transformation piece.
Absolutely. Unsurprisingly, they account for the largest portion of Japan's market for digital transformation services and products.
Makes sense.
We're seeing activity from both big domestic players like Fujitsu NEC, NTT Data, and also global tech giants setting up or expanding in Japan.
Right.
And there's a lot of collaboration and strategic partnerships happening. We mentioned SoftBank and NEC earlier, Vaiotochu partnering with PCG, GlobalLogic setting up shop. It's a dynamic space.
And how are tech companies themselves governed? Are they leading there too?
Well, some are. Sony, for example, was a relatively early adopter of the company with 3 committees board structure, which enhances independence.
Okay.
They tend to have more globally diverse leadership perspectives as well, given the nature of their business. So they're not just providing the technology. Many are also adapting their own operations and governance structures.
Got it. Are there any other sectors where we're seeing particularly notable shifts worth mentioning?
Yes, definitely. In retail, as we touched on, AI is being used a lot. Understanding customers, dynamic pricing, optimizing supply chains, personalized e-commerce.
Right.
The real estate sector is increasingly focusing on sustainability, green buildings, and using capital more efficiently. Companies like Daiwa House are leaders in energy-efficient buildings.
ZEH and ZEB, right?
Exactly. Net zero energy houses and buildings. And we're even seeing shareholder activism targeting real estate assets, like Elliott Management, urging Tokyo Gas to divest some non-core real estate holdings.
Wow, activism reaching into utilities' property portfolios.
Anywhere value is perceived to be locked up. And the energy sector itself, of course, is central to the whole decarbonization push.
Naturally.
Companies like Osaka Gas are setting ambitious carbon neutrality goals, investing in things like e-methane, and the government's green growth strategy is heavily supporting renewables and hydrogen development.
It sounds like really no sector is being left untouched by these various transformation waves.
That's fair to say. The pressures and opportunities are widespread.
Now, you mentioned some vanguard companies earlier, sort of leaders in this. Can you give us a few more specific examples of companies that are really navigating this new era of Japanese corporate management proactively?
Certainly. It helps to see concrete examples. Hitachi's a great one we already touched on. Significant restructuring, focusing on green and digital, governance reforms, bringing in GlobalLogic for DX.
Right. Very active.
Toyota is another, evolving its governance structure, emphasizing stakeholder value more broadly, alongside its huge focus on sustainability and future mobility.
Okay.
Sony has a long track record of adapting its governance, strategically reorganizing its businesses around creativity and technology, and emphasizing ESG.
Makes sense for Sony.
The major insurance groups we discussed are making significant progress in unwinding those cross-shareholdings and improving capital efficiency. That's a major shift.
Yeah.
Companies like Osaka Gas, Kirin Holdings in beverages, and Daiwa House in construction have all received external recognition, awards, for their leadership in ESG and sustainability finance.
So third-party validation.
Exactly. We're also seeing interesting collaborations in tech, like SoftBank and KDDI working together on 5G infrastructure deployment. And of course, those activist engagements like Elliott versus Tokyo Gas or Oasis Management versus the consumer goods company Kao, they highlight the real impact shareholder pressure can have now.
Right. These vanguard companies, are they setting the pace?
I think they are. They're really setting new benchmarks and inevitably influencing others in their sectors and the broader market to follow their lead or at least consider similar changes.
It's really helpful to see concrete examples of these broad trends playing out within specific, well-known companies. Makes it more tangible.
Definitely.
So as we look ahead, drawing toward the close, what are the major challenges and opportunities that Japan and its companies face as they continue down this path of corporate transformation? What's the outlook?
Yeah, there's several important things to consider looking forward. One significant challenge is overcoming that ingrained cultural inertia and resistance to change.
The old ways die hard.
Sometimes, yes.
Yeah.
Traditional practices like niwawashi, consensus building behind the scenes, ringy formal approval processes, hierarchy, emphasis on group harmony. They can sometimes clash with the need for speed, agility, individual initiative, and that stronger shareholder focus that the market is demanding.
Right.
There are also those concerns we mentioned about formality over substance, and some reforms just box ticking.
Yeah.
Some reports suggest companies aren't always feeling the tangible impact of things like the corporate governance code, or find some provisions just burdensome without clear benefit. And progress on things like promoting women internally remains slow.
So genuine change versus surface change.
Exactly. There needs to be a real mindset shift towards embracing managed risk, being more agile, focusing on growth.
Okay. What's another challenge?
Another challenge is finding the right balance between that traditional stakeholder model, considering employees, suppliers, community, and the growing pressure to prioritize shareholder value, especially with MITI's new takeover guidelines.
The Sympoyoshi idea, good for seller, buyer, and society versus shareholder primacy.
That's the tension, yes. How do you navigate that? And the ESG paradox we discussed.
Right, where ESG doesn't always boost short-term profits. That highlights the complexity, too. It requires artfully integrating shareholder value creation with ESG principles and genuine stakeholder engagement. It's not easy.
Definitely a balancing act. But what about the opportunities? It can't all be challenges.
Oh, absolutely not. There are significant opportunities. Companies that can successfully adapt, that embrace these changes.
Yeah.
They can become much more competitive, more efficient, more innovative, and attract more investment, both domestic and international.
So a chance to leap ahead?
Potentially, yes. We're likely to see a divergence, maybe a K-shaped recovery or evolution, between companies that adapt and those that resist or fail to change.
Okay.
The pressure will really mount on the underperformers, especially with the TSE's focus on those PBR1 companies.
So more restructuring ahead. M&A.
I would expect increased corporate restructuring, more M&A activity, both friendly and perhaps less friendly,
Right.
and potentially even some business failures for those companies that simply can't adapt to the new environment. Creative destruction, perhaps? So for investors watching Japan, what's the key?
For investors, active stock selection and really understanding how individual companies are navigating these transformation journeys will be absolutely crucial. You can't just buy the index and assume everything's fine.
You need to look under the hood.
Deeply under the hood.
Okay, so it's not going to be a completely smooth or even process, definitely some bumps in the road, but the overall direction of change seems pretty clear. It's happening.
The momentum is undeniable.
Finally then, to bring it all together, what's the main takeaway for you from this deep dive?
I think the key takeaway is that Japanese corporate management is undergoing a truly fundamental and actually increasingly rapid transformation.
Driven by that confluence of factors.
Exactly. Driven by that powerful combination of government regulations, more active shareholders, the undeniable demographic shifts, the pervasive rise of digital technologies, and the growing strategic importance of ESG.
And this presents.
It presents both considerable challenges, yes, in terms of overcoming established ways, balancing different priorities, but also really significant opportunities.
For who?
For those companies, leaders, and investors who can understand and effectively navigate this evolving landscape.
Right. Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you, our listener, a clear, engaging, and insightful understanding of these important shifts.
Without making you feel too overwhelmed by all the details.
Exactly. That was the goal.
So here's maybe a final thought for you to consider as we wrap up. How might these profound changes in Japan's corporate world potentially influence business practices and investment strategies globally in the years ahead?
Ooh, interesting question. Ripple effects.
Yeah. What less obvious aspects of this transformation, maybe something we didn't emphasize as much, might hold the key to future success, either in Japan or elsewhere?
Definitely something worth thinking about and exploring further. Food for thought.